that alone could have convicted him. Assuming the president ever sits down with special counsel Robert Mueller, Mueller could spend an afternoon questioning Trump on this.
Stop in or visit driveclassic.com anytime.
Bitch. I'm Michael Smirconish in Philadelphia. We welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. Just when you thought a bad week for the president could not get any worse, it did. The president was reportedly taped by his own lawyer discussing a payment to Playboy model Karen McDougal. We'll discuss the evidentiary implications. Plus, the president's strikeout after trying to do damage control after his Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin. President Trump may have made things worse when he deviated from the script. Overlooked by many, the 7 words he refused to say, which I think provide great insight into his view of the Russian cyber attack. And after his performance was panned, the president renewed his charge that the media is the real enemy of the people. But this week, when Sarah Sanders tried to ignore a question she didn't like, a reporter stood up for his rival colleague. He's here. And a movie that moved me. Adopted at birth by 3 different families, they didn't know about each other until they met at age 19. But then the story of these identical triplets took a dark turn. I'll talk to the director of the hit documentary, 3 Identical Strangers. But first, a bad week for the president ended even worse with reporting Friday by the New York Times that the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen, secretly recorded a conversation with Trump 2 months before the election in which they discussed payments to a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, who said she'd had an affair with Trump. This conversation was about a month after the parent company of the National Enquirer, AMI, paid McDougal $150,000 for her story and then did not publish it in a practice known as catch and kill. Today's Washington Post says that in the 90-second conversation, Cohen can be heard urging Trump to consider buying the rights to McDougal's claims to better control the story, according to people familiar with the exchange. Quote, "I think we need to bring this in-house," Cohen tells Trump, according to one person with knowledge of the recording. The Post also reports that Trump was largely silent in the conversation. The recording was part of the evidence seized by the FBI when it raided Cohen's homes and offices back in April. According to the Times, prosecutors want to know whether the conversation is evidence of any violation of campaign finance laws. And it would seem to contradict the Trump campaign denials of any knowledge about the affair and payment to Karen McDougal when the Wall Street Journal first reported the story, which was 4 days before the election. At that time, Hope Hicks, a Trump campaign spokeswoman, said this: "We have no knowledge of any of this." She said that Ms. McDougal's claim of an affair with Mr. Trump was totally untrue. The story at this stage raises more questions than it answers, not the least of which is, why would the president's own lawyer tape him? What other tapes might exist? Will the subject matter be protected by the attorney-client privilege or come under the crime-fraud exception? And might the president face a more perilous situation in New York's 2nd District than he does from the Mueller probe? From the perspective of prosecutors, perhaps the biggest legal question is whether any payments were made to protect the president's family or to influence the outcome of the election. Of course, the last time the president's voice was heard on an embarrassing tape, the subject matter was more carnal. But in that case, he emerged unscathed, while the person with whom he was speaking lost his job. Whether this ends the same way, well, that remains to be seen. Please go to Smirconish.com right now and answer today's survey question. Will the contents of Michael Cohen's recording help or hurt President Trump? I'll give you the results at the end of this hour. Joining me now, trial lawyer Shannon Spector, named by the National Law Journal as one of the top 10 litigators in Pennsylvania. He also teaches at Hastings, Stanford, Berkeley, and the Penn Law Schools. Full disclosure, I'm affiliated with his firm of Klein and Spector. Shannon, I need to show you a remarkable tweet from President Trump from earlier this morning. Put it on the screen. Inconceivable that the government would break into a lawyer's office early in the morning, almost unheard of, even more inconceivable that a lawyer would tape a client, totally unheard of and perhaps illegal. The good news is that your favorite president did nothing wrong. This brings it to a new level, right? Is there not now a public war between the two?
Yes, Mike, there appears to be. This is a very surprising tweet from the president this morning where he suggests that his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, committed a crime.
You teach rules of evidence to law students. So take me into the classroom, explain to me the attorney-client privilege and the significance of this news about Trump being taped by Michael Cohen about Karen McDougal.
Well, the significance of this tape is that it may indicate that there was criminal conduct by either President Trump or Michael Cohen or both of them. And the way we get there is the following. We start with the attorney-client privilege. And the attorney-client privilege says that a communication between an attorney and a client for the purpose of receiving legal services is privileged from disclosure to others. But there is a narrow exception to the attorney-client privilege, and that is where the communication is in furtherance of a crime or of a fraud. And that brings us to this tape that's been described in the New York Times and the Washington Post today, including by the president's attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, as concerning a discussion between President Trump and his then attorney, Michael Cohen, about a claim that was being made against then businessman Donald Trump. That communication would plainly be an attorney-client communication. Cohen representing Trump in connection with a claim being made by McDougal. So that then raises the question, how can this be lawfully released? And it can be lawfully released if the conversation was in furtherance of a crime or a fraud by Mr. Trump or Mr. Cohen or both of them.
So, the privileged conversation, put up that second slide again, because I love the way that he's walked us through it. A privileged conversation may be lawfully disclosed if the court has found it to be in furtherance of a crime or fraud. Shannon, we don't know how this ended up in the public domain, but you are positing the idea that perhaps it's because the special master, looking over the totality of all that evidence that was seized from Cohen, has determined that it falls under the crime-fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege.
Mike, that's exactly right. So federal Judge Kimball Wood on April 26th of this year appointed former federal Judge Barbara Jones to inspect the tape recordings and the documents that were seized from Michael Cohen on April 9th of this year. And she has ruled that almost all of these documents and things are not privileged, including a ruling just this past week that over 1 million such items were not privileged. And it stands to reason that this tape recording may have been one of those items.
Okay, read the tea leaves now. Who would have motivation to put this in the public domain?
Michael Cohen. He would not be permitted to do, well, first of all, he would not be permitted to do so before now because the communication is privileged absent the finding of the special master that the crime-fraud exception applies. He does have a motivation to put this out publicly for two reasons. One, to show his cooperation and assistance to the government in building a case against the president. And second, if he still entertains the thought that the president might pardon him, the putting of this tape into the public domain is a pressure point on the president that he can do the president great damage.
This story, as per the tweet and your reaction to it, has taken a dramatic turn today. True?
Yes, it really has, Michael. It's extraordinary that the president would suggest that Michael Cohen has committed a crime in relation to the tape recording of this conversation, which, by the way, appears to have occurred in New York State, in which there is one-party consent. And I'm sure that President Trump knows that because he's been involved himself in tape recording and in making statements going back to when he was a businessman and when he was calling into radio shows and the like. And he knows the law in New York on tape recording others. So not only is he wrong in suggesting that Cohen committed a crime in recording him, but to accuse his former lawyer, who simply said it may have the goods on him, of committing a crime is just a terrible, terrible idea.
Shannon, thanks for your expertise. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Michael.
I want to know what you think. Go to Smirconish.com, cast a ballot on today's survey question. Will the contents of Michael Cohen's recording help or hurt President Trump? What are your thoughts? Tweet me at Smirconish. Go to my Facebook page. I'll read some responses throughout the course of the program. What do we have? Smirconish, unfortunately, nothing is going to hurt him. Well, nothing may hurt him, Dotterer, in the eyes of the 46% who put him in office, but there's a whole different constituency here. And that constituency is in the 2nd District of New York, by the way, distinctly different from the Mueller probe. And how this plays in that investigation remains to be seen. One more if we have time. Smirconish, Cohen recorded Trump because he knew who he was dealing with. He also knew it would come to something like this someday. You know, I keep thinking, who else has he recorded? And might those tapes, beyond the president, he's a very loquacious individual, Michael Cohen, and very accessible to members of the media. What might other tapes show? Just wondering. Up ahead, the president received a lot of criticism for what he said in Helsinki, but I think what's more interesting is what he refused to say, and I'll tell you what I mean. Plus, a show of unity in divisive times. One journalist stands up for another. Why did he do it? He'll tell us. And triplets separated at birth but reunited years later by pure chance. They're
Let us with you. Call us at 1-800-213-8000.
With the stroke of a Sharpie and the striking of 7 words, the president may have told us everything we need to know about his intentions relative to the investigation of the Russian meddling in the 2016 election. As a result, his post-summit efforts at damage control after Helsinki and the meeting with Vladimir Putin only made matters worse. And that was before he invited Putin to the White House. Where to begin? Well, first, there was the timing. The president had ample opportunity to clear up any discrepancy before leaving Finland on Monday, especially where he did interviews with 2 Fox News personalities after the meeting with Putin ended, but before departing for home. Instead, there was no effort to say that he'd misspoken before Air Force One took off, probably because he said exactly what he meant to say. Second, the scripted claim that he later made that he had meant to say wouldn't instead of would is belied by the totality of that context. That one sentence wasn't an outlier. It was in keeping with his overall presentation while addressing the media in Putin's presence. In fact, it would have been odd had he both called Putin's denial, quote, extremely strong and powerful, only to then say, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. Third, when he read scripted remarks to try to convince the world that he really does recognize Russia's culpability, he couldn't resist going off script and pointing a finger elsewhere, quote, could be other people also, which was to me a reminder of that first presidential debate when he wondered whether the hack of the DNC server was the work of a 400-pound man. But here's the kicker that many have missed. It's what he refused to say aloud that had been spelled out in front of him. When the president welcomed the media into a meeting he was having with congressional leaders at the White House, he sat at a conference table with 4 pages of notes displayed in front of him. Of course,